Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I don't know how many of you, again, welcome. I don't know how many of you caught the Foreign Relations hearing yesterday. Senator Rubio was there. It got a little heated. Some viral moments. You took a different tack, though. You have a more collaborative approach with the Secretary of State. How's that working? Do you feel like you're able to convince him to make changes behind the scenes?
Well, it depends on the issue, I think. I had the opportunity to work with Marco Rubio from the time he came to the Senate until he was left to be Secretary of State. And so the Marco Rubio that I worked with in the Senate was very supportive of foreign assistance programs. He believed we needed to address disinformation and misinformation that was happening in the U.S. He was very knowledgeable about the regions of the world, particularly Latin America. So I would like to see that Marco Rubio back.
When it comes to some of the DOGE cuts, have you had success in convincing him, saying, actually, Marco, former senator to current senator, this one needs to stay?
Well, we've worked hard on that, and some of those have resumed. They have said they wanted to restore humanitarian and life-saving programs. I think there is a difference of opinion about what qualifies as humanitarian and life-saving. So, for example, the PEPFAR program, which I think we would almost all agree has been one of the most successful foreign assistance programs the United States has had to address HIV/AIDS in Africa. And what has been cut from that program is still all of the preventive efforts that are part of addressing HIV/AIDS. So that means that even though we may still be treating people who have HIV, what we're not doing is keeping more people from getting it. And so I would argue that that's not a good use of our funding, that we're better off to spend additional funds on prevention than to wait until we either have more people get infected or more people die because they get the disease. So there are differences like that that I think are really important in terms of U.S. foreign assistance.
I'm not hearing you criticize him that much. I think you want to keep the line of conversation open.
Listen, I think, I got elected first in New Hampshire when people actually talk to each other and work together. And I still think that's the best approach. That's what my constituents expect from New Hampshire. I think that's what most people in this country want. They want us to work together to solve the problems that are facing the country. And I still think that's a better approach than an adversarial approach. Now, as you saw in that hearing yesterday, clearly I don't agree with the Secretary on everything. Ukraine is one of those areas where I don't agree. I think we need to take stronger action against Russia.
And his answer to you was that he would eventually be open towards sanctions down the line. Do you feel like that is a 2025 time horizon for the administration, to 2026? And how much Republican frustration do you sense with the refusal to really move on this? It's a Lindsey Graham bill, right? It's a Republican bill.
I think it's a next week horizon. I think we need to introduce that bill that has 80 co-sponsors in the Senate. There is a similar bill that's working in the House. I think we need to introduce it. We need to make it very clear to Vladimir Putin that we are going to increase the pressure on Russia to get them to the table to resolve the war in Ukraine, to come to some sort of negotiated peace agreement. Because right now, what Putin is doing is playing President Trump. As I said yesterday, he's playing him like a fiddle. He keeps extending the time because he sees time as being on the side of Russia, not on the side of Ukraine and the United States.
How wide, you mentioned the 80 co-sponsors, but how widespread is that view in the Republican conference?
Those 80 co-sponsors are about equally divided between Republicans and Democrats. And I think it's fair to say that Senator Graham and other Republican senators that I've talked to think we need to move. Patience has run out. It's very clear that Vladimir Putin is not serious about coming to the table, and we need to show him that we are serious, that he needs to get to the negotiating table and figure out an end to this war.
Another big issue sort of coursing through our politics right now is trade, tariffs. The president was pretty clear with Mark Carney in the Oval Office that he's not going to be lifting that. So it's when you talk to Republican senators, they say, well, we're for tariffs, at least as a means to a goal, as a means to an end. But when you talk to Democrats, they almost have a similarly nuanced view. Is there anyone in your party that's really making an affirmative case for free trade?
Well, I'd like to think that I am.
Okay. Well, flush it out.
Look, when I was governor, I led the first trade mission overseas from New Hampshire. And one of the things I learned on that trade mission was how important it is to help our businesses get into international markets. I'm on the Small Business Committee. 95% of markets are outside of the United States, but only about 5% of our small and medium-sized businesses are doing business outside of the United States. We need to help them get into those international markets, because what I also saw is that when there is an economic downturn, when people are losing their domestic market, if they have an overseas market that they can go to, then they're going to be stronger. They're going to be able to survive. And so I think it's really important for us to help business get into international markets. It's, again, one of the other things I learned is that trade jobs tend to be more recession-proof. They tend to pay more, and that's a good thing. I want those jobs in New Hampshire.
So New Hampshire is the free trade or die state?
Well, you'd probably have trouble convincing people to live free or die.
And change that license plate. You obviously have the Portsmouth Navy shipyard. Are you hearing, and in a pretty big defense industrial base, are you hearing any feedback on supply chain snarls, even with the initial tariffs that were imposed? Now we're in this waiting period and they're working things out. What are you hearing from CEOs in your state?
There's real concern in New Hampshire from our business community about the impact of the tariffs, both about the industries that the tariffs have been placed on, the impact on our allies and partners. Canada, we do a lot of business in New Hampshire with Canada. We have a number of businesses that have been really affected by the tariffs on Canada and by the reaction in Canada that is meant for the United States. We do, as you know, we have a lot of tourism in New Hampshire, and what we're seeing is that a lot of our Canadian visitors have decided they're not going to come this year because they're upset. But I think, for me, the most significant story that I've heard from a business in New Hampshire is one that's part of our defense industrial base. They make ball bearings for the aerospace industry. They do a lot of their business with the Defense Department. What they told me there when I visited was that before the tariffs on steel that the president put on, their lead time to get steel was 20 weeks. Now it's 2.5 years. Our defense base cannot do what it needs to do to address the national security of this country with a 2.5-year lead time to get the materials they need to make the missiles, the equipment that we need to protect us.
So for potential 2028 candidates that might be visiting New Hampshire, is that the argument they need to make to really resonate with New Hampshire voters? Is this sort of free trade argument?
Well, I think it is more nuanced than that. As I said, I think free trade is really important, and we need to do a better job of promoting it. That helps to address the trade deficit. But there are particular areas that we do need to look at tariffs. I think China is one of those places where they have dumped products into the U.S. market, and it's appropriate when that's happening that we put tariffs on. Now, I think right now the percentage of tariffs is too high on China, but negotiating with China on what they are sending into the U.S. market, I think, is appropriate.
There does seem to be somewhat of a new consensus on China. I mean, Biden actually re-implemented a lot of the Trump tariffs on China, amped them up in some places. Just briefly on the former president, how are you and your former colleagues in the Senate processing his diagnosis?
I think people are very sympathetic to former President Biden, to his family, to all of the challenges that they have experienced, and wish them well. I certainly do. I hope that his treatment will be successful and that he will continue to live a number of happy years.
I'll bring this back to New Hampshire and the politics of it all. When you look at potential candidates that are already visiting, that are making trips, what does it tell you about New Hampshire's first in the nation status?
Well, as you may know, I got involved in politics working for Jimmy Carter when he was running for president, when he was still Jimmy Who. So I have a long history of working in the New Hampshire primary. And the thing that I think is the most exciting about New Hampshire's primaries are that you actually have to engage with voters. You have to go in, you have to answer questions, meet with people in their living rooms, go to diners, really talk to people. And I think that's important for the presidential selection process. I remember Elizabeth Warren talking to me after she had done her first trip to New Hampshire when she was running for president. And she said, "I can't believe the detailed questions that your voters ask me." And that's important. It's important for candidates for president to have to engage in that way. And there aren't very many places you can still do that anymore.
Who do you think's hot? Who do you think could be good?
Oh, I'm not gonna weigh in at this point. Well, we have a joke in New Hampshire that until you've met them all, you can't really tell.
So you're looking for 2-3 meetings and they need to come back. Well, let me ask it in a slightly different way. And that is, there's obviously this big debate in the party about what happened in 2024. How much of the conversation do you think will be looking at what happened in 2024, the Democratic Party's positions, as well as Joe Biden's ability to be a candidate and how long he stayed on the ticket, and how much of it will be forward-looking?
Well, I hope 98% is forward-looking, because that's what we need to provide. We need to provide a vision for this country that the voters want to see in the future. I think it's a vision that recognizes the importance of addressing cost of living for people, kitchen table issues. One of the things that I hear from people is that, groceries are still too high, energy costs are too high, they can't find affordable housing. They want health care that they can count on, that they can afford. And, Donald Trump, I think, got elected pledging to address all of that, and he's not done that. And I think that's one of the reasons that we're seeing the reaction from people.
Walk us through what the potential, at least the Medicaid cuts that we're aware of, will mean for rural hospitals in your state.
It'll have a huge impact. In fact, it could put some of our rural hospitals out of business. We know in New Hampshire, 1 in 7 people rely on Medicaid for their health care, and that's everything from children to disabled to people in long-term care facilities. We also have about 60,000 people in New Hampshire who get their health insurance through Medicaid-assisted health insurance that the state has passed, called the Granted Advantage Program. And if those people lose their health insurance, if they lose their health care, they lose their nursing home care, they don't have a lot of other options.
It sounds to me like you're still in the fight. Why'd you retire?
It would be nice. I don't expect to get out of the fight when I retire, but I do like the idea of having a little more time, a little more flexibility in my schedule. And, my husband's retired, so somebody has to stay home and take care of him. Make sure that he doesn't get into trouble. That's what I mean by taking care of him.
We'll do a speed round then. Are you going to manage another presidential campaign in New Hampshire?
Probably not.
Okay, done with managing. In your lifetime, we've got another minute here, 45 seconds, we'll run through these. Who's the best Republican candidate in New Hampshire?
John McCain.
Best Democratic candidate?
Oh, well, it has to be Gary Hart.
That's because you work for him.
Oh, well, of course. Actually, it was probably Jimmy Carter, because Jimmy Carter started out and nobody had any idea who he was. And by virtue of the force of his personality, he was able to win the New Hampshire primary.
What was a more devastating moment in presidential debates? The Walter Mondale to Gary Hart, where's the beef? Or the Chris Christie takedown of Marco Rubio?
Oh, I don't know. I would have to go with the worst beef because I was so involved in that campaign.
And had that debate not happened, Gary Hart could have been the nominee.
I think so. I think he still could have been the nominee.
Was Obama's "you're likable enough" comment really the reason Hillary won New Hampshire?
No, I think Hillary won New Hampshire because she had a reservoir of support there that went back to the days when Bill Clinton was ran for president.
Confident that New Hampshire is going to reclaim its first in the nation status?
I do believe that because I think people like it, the candidates like it, because I think it serves a purpose in the presidential selection process that's really important. And I think reporters like it.
We all have our biases as reporters, whether or not you're a New Hampshire person or an Iowa person. I'll ask you to finish the sentence or give me a yes or no answer. Is it true that Iowa picks corn and New Hampshire picks presidents?
Of course it is. That's a no-brainer,
Senator Shaheen, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.